It's been a while since I did a lecture in this auditorium setting. I teach at Royal College of Art in London. There is the whole idea that universities in UK, especially in London, are in a way disinvesting from the space. You know, space is a real estate. So they would like us to move to teaching online more and more. So it's actually, I've asked Miroslav to give me a tour of your building. So I wanted to see how the spaces that you study look. And it's actually really great to see that there is also all this space you can kind of inhabit. You could actually get out of your ateliers and do a little bit more with this beautiful building that you have. So I'm really happy to be back in Prague, and thank you so much for this generous invitation. And you have mentioned, I'm thinking about how do we teach architecture, but even more thinking about issues around in which way knowledge about space is something that is key for the contemporary life, and how architecture education is always more than just educating architects, is something that I have been thinking a lot ever since I was a student. And invitations to give lectures like this, which are focusing on pedagogy, actually allow me to do this kind of reflection on that. These are the topics that now I have been really thinking through for 20 years of my life, which all of a sudden is, I'm old, which is great. There has been a lot of accumulation of really various different experience. And it's probably been a really interesting period in which I started studying architecture in October, as usually you start studying, in '99. So I guess this has been a really exciting 24 years to follow what does it, to be part of transformation of architecture as a profession, the ways in which this was led or architecture education responded, and to think also about the ways in which, in this period of time, centrality of space and the centrality of space, and also realization that how we live and physical spaces are central to the cycles of capitalism, the kind of global interrelations. All of a sudden, housing prices in so many cities are really not connected just to the policies within those cities or municipalities, but they are somehow determined in the boardrooms on the other side of across some oceans. So I think that it's actually been really interesting for people of my age, and there are several of us of our age in the audience. It's been really kind of a journey to think through. So I think I'm going off my script, which I often do. Starting with this is to say that I think that some of the things I will be positions from which I will be talking about, some of these things today, are really come from the fact that I'm born in 1980. I was born in Niš, Yugoslavia, which is now Niš, Serbia. I studied in Belgrade. I did some post-academic work in Netherlands. I was living off, doing workshops and visiting lectures. Then I did my PhD in ETH, and all this was happening also by constantly trying to get out of the academia in order to learn more than what the academia was giving me. Then realizing, well, since I'm in academia, I can also bring what is left into it. So all this is to say, so often things we do are tightly connected with who we are, and it's good to have those moments of reflection, and so thank you for this generous space to have this reflection in front of everyone, because it helps, at least to me, but I think it helps a lot of students of mine, and I have been working with students in various constellations and in various spaces across Europe, to reflect on where them as persons and people are in relation to educational process they are part of. And some of the actually my whole lecture today is actually framed through these frameworks that Charlotte and I have been developing, but I have developed them further for this context of this particular lecture, what is really looking into how to create a classroom and where the classroom can be in which we grow consciousness about ourselves and about the processes we are part of and about what then is actually not just capital A architecture, because I think that's kind of determined, but what is small a architecture? What is spatial design? How do we design the world? How do we co-design with people in the world spaces that support life? And what kind of imaginaries we can also design for the future? And so in recent years, we have been really undergoing through these kind of processes of transformation in architecture. And while some of these things started especially in the kind of spaces of history and theory, the territories of architecture, which were really used kind of the framing of what is the canon, we have been like thinking through how do we broaden the canon, how do we also really go beyond the canon. What needs to change is in a way everything needs to change. So what does it mean to actually consider justice, racial justice, spatial justice, disability justice at the core of the ways we think what spatial design is? Because ultimately, this is where architecture is still the only profession which designs space in the relationship between humans. Architecture matters not because how facades of building looks. Architecture matters precisely in those moments where it should disappear so that life can take place. And how to then mediate between that and the fact that for so long, the idea of teaching architecture has been not about the relations it disables or enables to happen in space, but about how it looks. But before I move forward, I would really like to invite all of you to turn to a person sitting next to you and maybe introduce each other. So that we don't have just this alienating me talking to all of you, one directional thing. So please take a minute and introduce yourself to the Oh, this fell, I didn't see. Yeah. Okay, so maybe I can. So this is actually, this is architect, this is spatial design. You know, I might just go away because it works. So I will now assert my kind of position of power because I have the mic, and you all are forced to look at me because how we design classroom means a lot. So I'm going to assert it. So this is actually the second time I'm talking about architectural pedagogy in Prague. I also spoke about architectural pedagogy in 2019 when Maria, thank you for coming, is here, invited me, and then the invitation came because of the sense of urgency. But it seems to me that the sense of urgency just increased since that 2019. So since I was last here, the world has went through, and actually, if we are honest to ourselves, we are still going through a pandemic of entirely novel kind. So COVID-19, so parts of the world closed down, revealing how stark inequalities and injustices on which our world relies to operate are primarily spatial ones. Access to postcodes, access to geographies, access to that extra room that meant life. All this meant life or death to so many people. COVID revealed in much more brutal terms that there are parts of this planet dedicated to be sacrificial zones, and that this was not a novel but an ongoing process for centuries. It also showed that this is not these sacrificial zones and sacrificial bodies exist not only across territorial differences but within every city in the world. It also revealed and especially that even this thing that we call East, Central Europe and Eastern Europe also has that differentiation. And also where all these places we are from actually sit in hierarchies in relation to where do we think that we should sit in the hierarchies. And we all got confronted much more to understand how much of the ordering of our lives is spatial ordering. Before COVID-19 and after the climate collapse is accelerating, and architecture and education also have to come to terms to which extent the construction industry is the contributor on the global scale to that climate collapse. We are in the second month, also in the last 2 months, also reminded of the most brutal ways of the violence that apartheid and settler colonialism can enact. What connects all these problems, for lack of stronger words, is that the majority of the problems facing the world at many different scales, and actually at the compounded scales, issues of how we live, which are always issues of how we redistribute space amongst ourselves, are the key. They are both the key. The spaces built in the unbuilt environment are both key archive of the processes of centuries of ordering of the world, but they're also a key diagnostic tool. Looking at spaces helps us understand what is happening in the society, but they're also a key enforcement tool, or they can also be a key tool for liberation. Global housing crisis, global water crisis, all these global increasing compound crises at the moment are also all spatial crises. We are also coming to terms into also how much architecture is not just this noble discipline that culturally we are trained to see it, that it's a calling and not a job, but that actually this noble discipline is embedded in a lot of toxicity of the contemporary world. I think that my generation especially saw the shift of architecture from this bourgeois profession to becoming a bullshit job of a daily labor. But I think we also have to start to understand that so much of the spaces that are designed by spreadsheets and not by architects are bullshit construction. So how do we think about pedagogy and what do we actually do in that framework? Where do we start to think about what is an architect when the main architect is a spreadsheet which calculates costs and maximizes profits, no matter what externalized costs are? So what kind of architects we want to be, what kind of a spatial practitioner we want to educate. They're also connected profoundly with what kind of humans we want to be, for better or worse. So here I am again, making sure that we are, as an architect, think of ourselves as the most important ones. Not really, but we see things through space, and unfortunately or fortunately, that allows us to see the connection between things a little bit easier and hopefully in a more complex way than some other disciplines. So we are then coming to terms to what architecture education is coming to terms. What does it mean to train a new generation of architects for such an unstable present and future, and how to relate to the past, because architecture has this great thing in which every single built space is a knowledge that we can rely on, not just the canon. So we are in this moment of reckoning, and that's actually a really good moment to be in. So I'll read out this quote because it's so powerful when you read it out. I have never lived, nor have any of us, in a world in which race did not matter. Such a world, free of racial hierarchy, is usually imagined or described as a dreamscape, Edenesque, utopian. So remote are the possibilities to its achievement. How to be both free and situated. How to convert a racist house into a race-specific but yet non-racist home. How to enunciate race while depriving it of its lethal cling. This quote by Toni Morrison has been useful for me and for Charlotte, with whom I've been doing some of this work, to start to think about fixing capital A architecture and all of its houses. Only if these institutions acknowledge that their origin is grounded in racism, classism, and patriarchy, which are all the different ways in which we actually understand, all the different terms for exclusion through othering, can be possible to transform institutional design through spatial design, and spatial design through institutional design. And speaking in the architecture school, this change has to better where it matters most for the future, into how we teach. Thus, to ensure that the future of architecture will be based on the radical ethics of equity, we need a curriculum revolution. So this was one of the things that kind of started when Charlotte and I really wanted to kind of do it. So this is also how Charlotte and I opened that article called Frameworks for Curriculum Repair. That will be a basis of my talk. I have been thinking about architectural education and pedagogy with Charlotte and with other people for many years, even though we never actually taught together. I think that both of our educational practices have developed alongside and have been informed by this conversation. And this is a conversation in which we are not alone. There are so many different calls for rethinking education in the last 5 to 10 years, which center issues such as reparations, repair, justice at the core of rethinking where can architectural education go and what needs to be built on. So while this lecture has been a lot informed by this thinking with Charlotte, it has also been enriched by me being part of educational initiatives such as New Schools for Space, which I co-taught with landscape architect Alize Hanchuk and experimental preservation with Jonathan Solomon, a series of workshops in para-academic context I have conducted for the past 20 years. And I think this thinking has also been profoundly shaped by the contexts in which I taught. Belgrade University, Graz Technical University, and when I teach now, Royal College of Art. But also in the context of accredited professionally and then non-accredited degrees, and teaching also for non-architects, and teaching workshops which are not which are about space, but which are not aimed at producing architects who pass professional accreditation. This is where I speak from when I speak about education in architecture. And this is, again, another way of me situating, because being aware of the position from which one thinks and does is really one of the key aspects of transformation of pedagogy at large. It makes a difference when I speak from Belgrade, when I was an independent researcher not affiliated to any institution, or when I speak as someone who worked for Royal College of Art. Even though that Royal was added in the 70s as a promotional tool. So in a way, we have, for me, what was really important was to stop positing architecture as exceptional, but to start to understand it as entangled with so many other forms of cultural production. To understand that architecture plays its part in enabling, but also disabling certain forms of life to take place, by privileging other forms of life to take place instead of those. And one of the ways to kind of think through this is that the first thing that I actually only profoundly understood when I started to teach in the Royal Eyck Academie, because when you start to teach in the art school, you are confronted with this really weird situation. Students of paintings are painters. Students of architecture are students. They are not assumed to have a practice. Contemporary artists are artists. They have a practice. They are not recognized by the institution as someone who is in the lab. I don't have a right to call myself an architect in UK or actually in any other place because I didn't go to the professional certification. I could easily maybe call myself a special practitioner. But there is a reason why accreditation is important, because of safety, like health and safety, and the fact that it makes a difference. One should know that someone kind of figured out that the building won't collapse on our heads. We have seen really horrible consequences of messing up with that system with the earthquake in Turkey that happened at the beginning of this year, which also reminds me of that we have gone through so many brutal catastrophes this year that I even forgot, not me as a kind of big mega brain that records events, but I was recently really surprised to remember that was this year actually. So there is a reason why certain forms of kind of professional responsibility are really important. What would it actually mean if we would understand that maybe we start calling our students architects and not constantly make this big, are you still an architect if you move, are you? So this is something that, which also brings me to think about, well, these are all the standards. And standards have been really a problematic thing in architecture. And for instance, architecture data by Ernst Neufert, which I assume at least some of you have, I wasn't given it as this is the book you have to own as an architect, was not only included female figures only in when kind of describing cleaning, and male figures in every other images in the book, was also designed in the moment of National Socialism. So what does it mean to understand the conditions under which certain standards are produced, which inform, and stop thinking about them as given, as this is common sense. So, how to start to think about that culture is something through which we also become architects. There is a culture of education which we have to also respond to, and this is also this. I've been using a lot of we all the time, and this we is really a complicated category. So I don't. So let's for this temporary moment think we here in this room who are interested in thinking together what are the frameworks with which we co-design an education. So for we, which in this context was Charlotte Malterre-Barthesovou and myself, in 2019, the idea was we need a curriculum revolution. And the change has to happen within the curriculum and within the academia, which is kind of like both of us have been invested in architecture as educators. So you don't start the best way is to start the revolution is you try to start to change where you stand. And teaching is a complicated, we all, like, architects are one of those professions which constantly discuss what profession is. I don't think dentists really spend their time overnight in the bars discussing dentistry. And then even a worse category of this subset of people dealing with architecture are architectural educators. Because if there are other kind of group in the world that constantly discusses their own position, those are academics. So there is always, so we are all troubled by the context in which. So we also always have to kind of apologize about ourselves. And this is really interesting. And this quote from Stefano Harmi and Fred Morton from Undercommons really helped me understood why is it so. So they say, the university needs teaching labor despite itself or as it itself, self-identical with and thereby erased by it. It is not teaching that holds this social capacity, but something that produces the not visible other side of teaching, a thinking through the skin of teaching towards a collective orientation to the knowledge object as future project, and the commitment to what we do, and the commitment to what we want to call the prophetic organization. But it is teaching that brings us in. We can kind of paraphrase this and say, but it is architecture that brings us in. We talk about architecture because deep down we know it's a matter of life and death. So we are constantly embedded into it, and we have to, and so how to use this not as emotional blackmail that we have to be overworked and underpaid in the architecture offices because that's the way how to get better architecture. So how not to use that part, how not to use the fact that we are all, that architecture brings us in because the space brings us in no matter what we do, as emotional blackmail that squeezes out of us more, but actually as a force that brings us together to think and build different, better worlds. So we need to change the curriculum. Revolution is always good. You can see UK, that's what you get when you never have a proper revolution. Intersectionality is important. Because it insists that we always exist both as individuals and as groups and the intersection of many axes, and allows us to more comprehensively always see that these axes always overshadow some other. So it's not binary. So that's why intersectionality is good. Because architecture, besides having a gender problem, which is often the most discussed, has a class and race problem. And then if you teach, you're obsessed about the school. Maybe if I was a practitioner, maybe this would be about the office, but maybe not. This is also because all these big words that I just kind of showed you with the definitions from a dictionary are boiled down ultimately to the question of definitions. that whole thing, am I allowed to call myself an architect when I'm talking to you from here, or should I call myself as a teacher? Even though technically in UK I also still need to do some fellowship thing that kind of certifies me as a teacher as well. So really brings to that whole kind of, for me, this is one of my favorite quotes ever. Because it really kind of makes it precise that it really is, what is really important is who defines. And that the power is in kind of definition. Architecture has for a long while also left to other disciplines to define what architecture is. So real estate, together with urban planners, but mostly real estate, define what happens where in the cities. Austerity measures define what kind of a public infrastructure, do we have parks or we don't, do we have libraries or not. So how do we actually claim a position of defining? What constitutes LEED and all the certification all of a sudden started to define what is a green building. So how do we start to think through what does this definition mean and who actually has the power to define? So before I jump into other matters, into actually proposing some of these new frameworks around which education can be retaught, I will kind of throw some basic premises around which help me think through this work and to some people and practices that I find inspirational. And one of the most important for me is this concept of really useful knowledge. So, in the 19th century in UK, and this is interesting, I started using this concept way before I even thought I'm going to move to UK, and all of a sudden, I'm kind of trying to kind of think it through from where it was developed and implemented. So around 18th to 19th century, education started to be mainstream. So all of a sudden, there was this idea that working classes should also be educated. This process was led by philanthropic institutions and by church, and the idea was working class should get some skills. It helps not to be killed with a machine if you can read a warning, and so useful skills. In response to that useful idea of teaching just useful skills, defined by ruling elites what useful is, chartists and various different ways, working class started to self-organize around reading groups, circular libraries, in order to claim access to really useful knowledge. So not the knowledge that helps them be a useful worker, but the knowledge that allows them to understand the world in which they operate and to understand the position in their position in the world. Because the first step of changing the position in the world is by understanding. So the tired bodies of workers would decide to spend their nights not sleeping, because they would work for 15 hours, by reading Marx and Capital, or some other things, writing poetry, teaching themselves about what we now call humanities, useless knowledge, as we are told by more and more. Do what Jacques Rancière calls proletarian nights, the incredible kind of cultural production, which challenge that idea of the useful knowledge. That the really useful knowledge is the one that allows one to understand who they are and come together and constitute themselves as a group. The friction between useful and really useful knowledge in architecture is big. Architectural education. There is a constant pressure that the architectural students should be trained in softwares, because that will make them more easily employable. It's these practical tools. But what about all those auxiliary programs, seemingly auxiliary programs, which would allow architecture students, when they are architectural practitioners and their software is being phased out because there's some new software and there are new younger architects just coming out of university and therefore a cheaper labor to actually reinvent themselves. We have, if we claiming what is useful for a discipline or for practice of designing spaces and through that designing relations, and not letting that be defined through external is one of the fundamental things that we need to challenge, especially in the moment in which so many architectural faculties are being criticized by the practices that no one really knows. New graduated architects don't really know how to do the work. Rosexo, Adams, and Yvonne Sintoyo-Resco, thinkers and architectural educators who co-direct Bard program for architecture at Bard College in New York, in upstate New York, have been developing this concept of spatial literacy as one of the concepts within the framework of the new curriculum they have been developing in the school. One that they want to do, that they are consciously growing in order to decouple architecture from its common sense. So they are trying to kind of decouple the idea, this is what architects should know, and this is what architecture should be taught. That's the beauty you get when you start from scratch a program in a liberal arts college, which is a minor and not a major, which means that it doesn't have to be accredited. So they say, free from NWAB accreditation requirements and hosted by an institution that is well known for pedagogical experimentation, this context became ideal to propose a new model of liberal arts education that avoids mimicking the curricular structure of accredited programs. We began by considering the premise of architectural education, especially within the context of a non-professional degree. How can architectural education engage the world beyond the dominant professional paths? How can curriculum speak not only to students wishing to enter the professional field, but also to those with no intention of studying architecture? More importantly, how can the immersive context of a small college allow for an architectural education that departs by confronting the structural injustices of an asymmetrically broken world? They say, like any curriculum, ours is a gamble on the future. And I really like that shift. Curriculum is seen as something you have to fulfill and fill up in order to gain pre-prescribed knowledge. What does it mean when we shift thinking about curriculum not as a prescription, but as a site of construction of a future together? So, within their kind of curriculum, they have defined something that they call axes of intentionality. They have three axes of intentionality: spatial literacy, socialized disciplinary context, and architecture as a world-making practice. For this purpose, now I'm going to just read you how they define spatial literacy. By unsettling architecture's common sense, dislocating it from its tight association with consolidating forms of power and demands of capital, what if architecture instead names a way of seeing the world? How can architectural education engage the worlds beyond the dominant professional paths? In other words, spatial literacy asks us not so much to see architecture from a broader perspective, but rather to pose the question, For whom is architecture a matter of concern? How can architectural knowledge be equally urgent for an aspiring architect and for future environmentalist, journalist, policymaker, curator, geographer, sociologist, or anyone else interested in using built space as a datum from which to consider the world? As a whole, we ask in architectural pedagogy that not only trains architects per se, but also opens architecture as an analytical tool for other disciplines, pronouncing the importance of spatial literacy to the humanities and beyond, aligning it with practices and projects working outside of capitalist development. I read them because I feel they put in words things I'm thinking about much better than I do, that maybe has to do with the fact that Ross is a native English speaker and I'm not. But it has to do with my profound belief that there are two-step process to happen. One is that architecture, there are unspoken things which are implied. We discuss in the architectural classroom spaces, but they always have to take some kind of a form in order to be discussed. But we take for granted the fact that we are literate in reading space. What does it mean to actually start to be aware of what does this spatial literacy means? And to which extent then it's an obligation to expand this idea of the spatial literacy not just within the academia but actually to the outside world. Because in order for worlds to change, how we use space has to change. And architects are aware. Architects try to design unprivatizable space all the time when designing privately owned public space. Thinking through spatial literacy will, I think, help architecture, especially those who don't want to play by the given rules, to form alliances with those outside of the architecture, who have to live in the spaces designed even by proxy of some architecture. So how do we form these alliances if we don't have the common language? And space is our common language, the one that we need to figure out how we can become literate together. And this is also really a situated thing. And one of the most formative things for me personally was this thinking through what is the praxis. So not what is the practice, but what is the praxis in the sense of educator Paulo Freire, which was not all for him as a public educator in Brazil. It was not about access to knowledge, was not the only thing that was important. People gaining knowledge had to act together upon their environment in order to critically reflect upon their reality and in order to transform it through further action and critical reflection. This, I understood much later, happened to me of bringing certain things I was interested by encountering the work of Center for Urban Pedagogy, which was in early 2000 set up in New York by Damon Rich and his colleagues, inspired by emancipatory public education of Miles Horton and Freire, which basically started to produce pamphlets communicating to the street vendors in New York what are the rules of being a street vendor. That police cannot harass you if your stand is temporary, it's this big, it's only sitting on the street, on the pavement if it's this wide. To produce this in languages of the street vendors, but also to make this abstract policy which sits on in some official magazine and some old website, legible to people who live it every day. The power of architects to understand how abstract rule shapes space, and the firm belief that one can through that actually co-create the world with the people who are being policed because they don't visualize that abstract knowledge. And I think that you have this, as students, you probably have one of those moments in which you see a project which really brings all your interests together. And this one, my tiny obsession about how laws produce space, how invisible produces physical space, and that idea of public education really brought it together. And I think like ever since then I've been trying to recreate these conditions, but obviously not necessarily have, because I teach in the architecture school, I don't. But how to take that idea that architecture is making things in public really to its fullest understanding. Because so much of space is not designed just by material design of building something in physically in space, but it's designed in the rules that create conditions for these physical things to happen in space. And that should be the core of our thinking in an expanded way, where our interventions and responsibilities lie. But but of course, schools are a really great place to start. Because the schools are sites of ideally critical thinking, and a lot of change that it gets initiated is often initiated in the world not by noticing, oh, this works wonderfully, but actually when it doesn't work. Infrastructure is really the best example about that. We don't really think about every day when we turn on a pipe and we can pour water and drink that clean water. We don't think about the miracle that it works every day. You just notice when you turn off the pipe and it doesn't work. My favorite thing that really I'm amazed about the capacity of the world to do things is postcards. How the postcards don't get lost is beyond my comprehension. Like I lose a little cardboard piece of paper all the time. How does the postcard I send to my parents who are now retired, and my dad really wants me to send him postcards no matter where I go, how the postcards arrive in a world which is so unequipped and less capable of handling complex things. Postcards still seem to be moving around. So we notice infrastructure more when it does not work. We notice architecture even, you don't really notice that there is a roof unless it starts leaking, then you actually start to notice the roof. Which makes one realize that complaint is actually one of the best research tools we can have. Because these are one of the best ways to become aware, how to learn institutions in order to unlearn them. How do we start to break through institutional and disciplinary common sense? It's about complaining. So it's not surprising that this discourse of thinking through what is architectural education is the most advanced in the academic institutions, because this is where the change can happen with the least resistance and threat, because to the kind of exist economic models underlining the production of built environment. We are not anymore really taught what should we teach by the university, as long as students are paying fees. That's at least in the UK. But the change that started in a lot of educational contexts is of growing number of female architecture students asking, where are the teachers who teach me who look like me? Where are the guest reviewers who teach to come and comment on my project that look like me? So noticing lack and articulating as a complaint started to be a way to drive the change. There is, of course, a limit to which this type of transformation really is completely transforming. But I guess I'm telling you, there's a lot of students, you know, like, complain. I know that Dean won't be happy for me telling you this, but complaining in school for better conditions can help you understand that this is an imperative, this is a requirement you can put also on the outside world and not just internal world. And it will help one understand better. But of course, while universities in general and schools of architecture in particular are pressed into presenting a facade of progressivism by demands emerging both within and outside their institutions, the need to make fundamental change to their overall approach is not necessarily always addressed. There is a limit to what complaint can change. It maybe just helps you see better how deeply entrenched certain positions are. In keeping what Olufemi Taiwo discusses in Elite Capture, to respond to the pressing needs of our world, it's not simply optics that needs to change. In case of architectural education, what needs to be revolutionized is architecture itself. Most of architecture's academic institutions and even more practices still end up aligning their understanding of what it means to be an architect with the view established by the economic system. They seem to disregard the warning issued by Robert Goodman in his 1972 polemic after the planners that, quote, our economic system has traditionally reduced the architect, the planner as the environmental designer, to the role providing culturally acceptable rationalizations for projects whose form and use have already been determined by the real estate speculation. End of quote. Acknowledging that the basis of architecture as a common knowledge is grounded in white male supremacy means reconsidering all relations anew within and around the profession. What is at stake is unlearning as much as learning and relearning. The curious idea that only a select few should have the prerogative of designing the world to their liking and subjective good taste or its narrow understanding must be put to rest. What is needed is a new spatial social contract centered on racial, social, environmental justice, at least. And so what we need is a kind of really this revolution, which does not occur only on counting names and looking kind of bibliographies, not only in the auxiliary courses, but across formats and especially within the studio. Maybe with time we even figure out different ways of studying architecture, which are not still bound to this idea of a unit master as the only form of proper teaching, without referring back to prescriptive design as a problem solution alternative. An architectural curriculum which acknowledges power relations in architecture and understand that your education of architecture is one of the ways to foster change. And when you think about it, we are living at this moment into that, we are seeing already the traces of what is being taught in architecture school making change within the architecture profession. Those students in UK who are those architectural practitioners, workers in architecture's offices, who are now unionized in UK, or who are fighting in various offices in US to be unionized, mostly failing, but still fighting. Those are the students who actually started to be told about labor in their courses, usually auxiliary courses, and often because they were asked to consider who builds your architecture. Those students got the really useful knowledge of understanding architecture as labor, which then should be also analyzed through the labor conditions, within how they practice in the offices, and started to understand that the way to change that is banding up together and fighting for better working conditions. That type of change also shifts, will eventually at some point probably also shift to what is expected to architectural design and projects to be. Because it matters how we produce things. So all those different reading lists, syllabi, lecture series, after studio, outside, everything that happens outside of the classroom, not just within the classroom, even though they seem insignificant, are really important and significant. And schools are changing. There are so many different initiatives which are aimed at changing schools. Architecture, Real Capitalism, Dark Matters University, African Futures Institute, Lowell Radius Trade School, Urgent Pedagogies, Ministry of Space in Belgrade, Material Cultures, Riot, all these different places. Green Deal, Super Studio, the idea of teaching studios as networks, relations that think through a different institutional organization, similar problems, and do not compete who is doing it the best, but actually share knowledge and piggy bank on the fact that different institutions are situated differently locally, and that together we can produce the knowledge of how do we deal with this big monster that's already transforming how we live, the climate collapse. It's important to acknowledge that things are changing. Join studios. I really like your architecture fact, but it also keeps you all siloed. Each studio is within a small, its own silo. So how do you break through that? How do you break your studios and actually try to think through transversally and not just, how do you have a studios and refuse the competition between which studio is the best? Students can change that more than professors. You have much more power to change that. But also, what are the studios doing? When I teach at RCA, Royal College of Art, so many studios are about reuse, adaptive reuse, about rituals and ceremonies, small interventions. Gone are the days, hopefully forever, in which, in order to graduate, you design an airport. Or at least 100,000 square meters office building. It has to be big. And how do we make the knowledge of architecture more accessible? Knowledge that is not only on scroll, knowledge of common knowledge of architecture does sit in the built or imagined never built projects. But are the endlessly scrolling blogs and websites the only way that we can access this database? How do we remember that a lot of these battles are not new battles, and that there are bodies of knowledge which might not help us solve things now, but might offer an inspiration? But even more, what are the knowledges that are being produced now from those who are fighting against being gentrified, against being redeveloped for private development, against extractive battles, against transforming forests into monocultures, against new mines? What does it happen when we start to see those sides of struggles as the production of knowledge that we learn from? and implement in architecture schools. Because as I say, the change is already happening. So where do we stand? And how do we, what are these frameworks that I've been promising you for an hour I'm going to give you? So now I'm going this. It's going to be now a more moving forward with a kind of incomplete list of frameworks to support this process of kind of rethinking curriculum as a step forward to a completely, hopefully, a new space we can get. So these frameworks, as I said, were initially developed by Charlotte and me. I have added more, but they're also yours to take and develop and take. They are not prescriptive, and they should ideally be collectively organized changes contextual to the institutions in which they are taking place, or responding to the context in which they are called upon. As Bell Hooks articulates, quote, as a radical standpoint perspective position, the politics of location necessarily calls those of us who would participate in the formation of counter-hegemonic cultural practice to identify the spaces where we begin the process of revision. So there are no silver bullets, and what works in one institution, in one specific context, in one specific design studio, does not necessarily work in the other if it's just transported as a ready-made thing. So we have to think with these things and not just blindly implement them. What worked in one academic year, what was revolutionary even in one academic year, might already be something that doesn't work the next. Frameworks are not recipes to be followed to the letter, but triggers to inspire action and points of recognition to inspire cross-cultural conversation and collaborations. The way I'm going to read them out now is not organized sequentially nor hierarchically. Frameworks should be understood in the way that Stefano Harney and Fred Motter called in the way that what Stefano Harney and Fred Motter called props, which enable, quote, entering into some new thinking and into a new set of relations, a new way of being together, thinking together. End of quote. They should be treated as a content of what Ursula Le Guin considers a carrier bag to transform the classroom into the site of emancipated learning. One of the things that get constructed in the classroom is both individual and collective conscientization and consciousness of the practitioner. And ultimately, as those who teach now, the only hope we have is that we have prepared our students, generations after us, that they can reinvent what architecture is, what education is, what their practice is. The frameworks follow the view, quote, the view that reparation is a construction project, which is proposed by Olufemi Otaiwo, and consider spatial education as not given, but as actually an ongoing construction site, which we co-produced together, students and teachers. So, be situated. The curriculum is a situated process. Ask where the students in the classroom come from and what kind of practice they want to engage with, what they are prepared to share, and what their specific needs are. It considers understanding how much are semester fees and how much does it cost to 3D print the 3D model, and that maybe striving for a beautiful working model is counter to the fact of being situated and considering. Prioritize reuse. Challenge the idea that a good project is something no one has ever seen before as a form. Prioritize education that looks with fresh eyes at what skills and materials and structure exist in the local context, how they are used and how they can be used. Use what Charlotte Malterre-Barthesovou proposes as the moratorium of new building in a situated way, as an analytical as much as a propositional framework. You know, in London it makes complete sense to transform abandoned churches into what Adam Greenfield calls lifehouses, a warm and cold spaces that exist for a community or any other thing that exists for a community level. They don't necessarily always need to be nicely photographed cafes. Challenge individual authorship. It is not just the fossil fuel which is setting the planet on fire. It's this cult of individualism and individuation which is doing that. Okay, sorry, I just confused my slides. Interrogate material flows. It is not just fossil fuel. It's really like we need to challenge the materials we are force-fed to design with. And we articulate the new ways to build without them, to use them less, or to use other materials. But that again means being situated. When in 2014, number of mostly European, often Dutch-funded architects started to propose the ways Rojava can rebuild itself. They started to see, oh great, you can build out of plastic bottles, because not realizing that there are no extra plastic bottles in Rojava. And why would architecture built in a post-conflict context be built of these plastic bottles as the go-to material? Maybe cement, maybe concrete is in some context still the best material to use. Maybe wood is actually the wrong thing to use in a certain context. But the only way to know that is to actually interrogate not just what aesthetically that material is doing in your project, but to consider it in the whole cycle. Because maybe it would be great if you could get it in 100 kilometers distance, but because you have to get it from 200 kilometers far away, you maybe use another material. This is the one. Challenge individual authorship, which is also toxic, and individuation. That's it. The big problem of architectural education is that while projects are individual, implicitly we all know, sitting together in the architecture studio, wondering should you stay until the very last metro or run home earlier, is that you actually know that so much of your project has been a product of thinking together. So it's really important to differentiate responsibility. The Grenfell fire that happened in London in 2017 on 14th of June, in which 72 people died, when what you would have been a benign fire of a fridge, starting a small fire in a kitchen and spread incredibly quickly all over a facade, is the best horrible case of what happens when individual responsibility, when irresponsibility is constantly pushed on others. Because architects specified for a redesigning of a facade of a council house to make it more beautiful to look from outside, a flammable construction material that was specified not to be used at that height, that those who produced it knew it's so flammable that they had to abort the test in the specialized lab because there was a danger it will destroy the lab. And the producer was hiding this. And everyone who checked this project thought someone else has checked it. Responsibility matters. Individual authorship does not exist in architecture, or probably in any other thing, any other creative or any other discipline. Pushing authorship instead of individual responsibility or responsibility needs to be refused. Challenge your tutors. Why can't you do a group project? And figure out how it passes how it ticks all the boxes that diploma requires. Because we need to change modalities in which collective and group work by students and not just by students are recognized and valued. Writing with and togethering. The feminist framework described by Anou Hušman for writing architectural history together and by Anna Maria Long for doing things collaboratively can offer ways to co-think, co-learn, and co-create differently. Because when we collaborate, we also have to work with difference. And what Anou Hušman says, I quote, how to collaborate across various structural divides gets at the core of feminist and anti-colonial questions. Why do we produce knowledge? For whom? And at whose expense? And who is reflected in that knowledge? End of quote. And we can think of architectural projects, replace knowledge with architectural projects. So acknowledge and work, but work across the difference. What if difference is not instrumentalized, as, and again Anou Hušman asks, not as a process of othering, but instead of a process of togethering? What if we actually do recognize that we all know different things and we all bring different aspects of thinking? And instead of creating that, using that as a way to separate between good students and bad students, or useful knowledge or unuseful knowledge, or valuable contribution or unvaluable contribution, what does it mean to create contexts in which we can actually see this as enriching because there is a common goal? Challenge hierarchies but accept responsibilities. As we question educational hierarchies in the classroom, we should not dismiss the asymmetries of power we bring in. I am the one holding the mic, you're stuck here with me. As much as I like flatness, this setup really reminds us of that there is an asymmetry of power. The quest for horizontality of learning process should not lead to a teacher abandoning responsibility for the process or privileging those habituated to speak aloud with ease in front of the group. Introduce new pedagogical strategies that to challenge speaking and discussing and bring others in. So when I taught this workshop called New Schools for Space, which was part of Making Futures projects co-developed by Raoul Labor, which I know were speaking before me in the series, with Elise Hanchuk and Jonathan Solomon, we set up a reading group as one of the formats through which we were working with our group over the course of 2 years. So we read together and then we discuss, and after 2 days, that actually meant that only few people were actively part of this conversation. The group was big enough that there are people not comfortable in speaking in front of others actually could hide, and we would not even notice because we were having an interesting discussion. So I'm eternally grateful to Becca Rose, who after 2 days came to me and told me, it's really pity because, you know, I would like to say some things, but it doesn't, I am not really comfortable, but I've just been on another workshop there where they introduced this really nice format called silent conversations. Can we maybe use that as a way to bridge this space between who speaks in the workshop? So we said, yes, let's try it. So silent conversation, so I got that, this, I'm so grateful because this is, then I got to learn about silent conversation. I have been using them in every single teaching I'm doing. Because silent conversation is a discussion format that uses silence and writing as a tool for facilitating the exploration of topic in depth. In the groups of 3 to 5, so I'm now giving you a recipe. In the groups of 3 to 5, respond to a question, statement, or a provocation individually on a sheet of A4, or a sheet of paper. It doesn't need to be A4. If we were in the US, that would be letter format. After a short time agreed upon in advance, 2 to 3 minutes, set a clock, responses are passed to the next person into the group. Read what is on the sheet of paper and respond like you're having a conversation in writing. All forms of mark making is encouraged: drawing, writing, sketching. When you get your original sheet back, reflect on those ideas in the small group, because there have already been a discussion on each of these individual papers, and then in a larger groups. And then you can keep the sheets of paper for the as a visual record or not. After we did that for the first time, everybody spoke in a larger discussion, because they saw that their ideas matter. The people engage with their thinking, that they're not boring, that they're... So the one big bridge of who gets to speak in that specific context was passed. Think of these ways. If it's hard to step up and say, I'm not comfortable with this, can we format, can we change? But it's important to also do that. You don't have to do that in front of people, but this is how we are changing also how we design. And that's what is important as well. Consider translation. I'm talking to you in English. That's not my first language. It's probably not the first language of majority of people in this room. The words mean different things. We understand things differently, even the specific words, even if we speak the same language. Community means a different thing. Public space means different thing. What does it mean if we put conversation about what are the words that carry the information of what we're supposed to design in a studio discussed as well? Can we then broaden up and better understand what is actually a task? Address the classroom as a physical space. Be in the present and acknowledge that material objects and setups in and around the place we gather to teach, learn, and study in the classroom, studio, and auditorium shape how we relate to each other and can reinforce and challenge power asymmetries. I wish I could kind of invite you all to come sit with me in a big circle, but it's an auditorium. There's an idea. Person sitting here has really something smart and important to say, and you're here to just soak that in. Challenge project temporalities. Look beyond the work of architect as a sole designer to think through about questions of maintenance, post-occupancy, and afterlife. As Miro Lademan Ukeles, an artist and author of Manifesto for Maintenance Architecture, asks, after the revolution, who's going to pick up a garbage on Monday morning? Who cleans your projects? Is it going to be easy for them to clean your project? Who fixes a facade? What does it mean to interrogate these questions not as an afterthought of the project, problems someone else has to solve? How to insist that this is sometimes where the project starts? Because sometimes the project is not about building an extension of a school. It's about reorganizing a schedule. Because when you think about it, architecture is space and time, and that's also a schedule. Understand education as an emancipatory praxis. Become students of bell hooks and Paulo Freire. The education of architects in the future has to become an emancipatory praxis, pursuing the reflection and action upon the world to transform it. This Freire dictum they already mentioned. Yet, immediately after we say it has to be emancipatory, the Freirean response is to ask emancipatory for whom? Architectural projects are often emancipatory, but for capitalism, entrepreneurship, they are emancipatory for bigger profit making, and especially for tax brackets. But is that really an emancipation? Can an emancipatory spatial education lead to design of spaces that are genuinely emancipatory for those who use it? But this is really hard within this economic system. The need to strive and produce spatial knowledge that is not just tailored to this economic system in which we are living in is really important. What is the architectural knowledge for a system in which space is not a commodity? Ruth Wilson Gilmore, abolitionist and geographer, proposes life as in rehearsal as a form of abolition. Living as if the world we want to build together is already there. I can't think of a better place to practice that rehearsal than architecture school. We can't wait for a new world to come and then start to think what is facing that new world. We have to imagine it so in order to be able to fight for it. And the time is really now. Which brings me to something I often really think about. What is the ethical position of a teacher teaching in the architecture school? What is my ethical position? How do I prepare, how do I, with my colleagues, not alone, prepare those who are architect students for the unknown, which is outside of the architecture school? Question normality. Denaturalize the idea of standards and make designing for all different bodies and routines by centering disability justice. Use David Gison's architecture of disability, which reminds us that disability has always, designing for disability has always been part of the history of built environment. But the ones that historians of architecture, especially in the 19th century, decided not to see. And then developed the preservation as a way to erase and preserve from monuments of architecture. We have to stop positing architecture as exceptional, but to start really to understand it as this kind of entangled form. Reconsider preservation while we are at it. Can we think of protection of life and not just for cold walls that stands for nothing once the life that made them important and special got gentrified out of it? My favorite example for this is the monoculture of tourism that Diocletian Palace, the center of Split, is transforming into. The only reason why that structure still exists is because thousands of people inhabited the house of one in the moment when it got abandoned, the Roman villa, built next to a sulfur well, which made it free of flies, and so there was life that was built there. So what happens now when the preservationists are going and putting only tourism and cleaning up all Diocletian's palace? When tourism collapses, as all monocultures do, and it will inevitably will, what future is of this preserved place? And I don't need to tell you all about it. You live in Prague. And how many of you actually use the center of the city, of the old town, in your everyday life? Can you claim a different imaginary for that space? And not just let it for the imagination of those who see spreadsheets? Challenge, or even better, abolish private property. Property is neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism spelled differently. If you need more convincing, because you should know that just because I have the mic doesn't mean that I speak the truth. Please go and read at least Brenda Bander's Colonial Lives of Property. question the idea that the private property is the best way to, and the only ordering regimes of how we think spatially. Recognize labor, acknowledge that architecture is a labor, not a calling, as Eyck Academie, amongst many others, reminds us. Don't also fall for pseudo-democratic narratives of participation that ignore that participation is to a work, as Andrew Hersher, amongst others, sharply discusses in his text, Community and the Disallowed Labor of Participation. Know the bodies that make architecture. A good place to start this is a reported method of inquiry developed by Who Built Your Architecture work by Mabel O. Wilson, Jordan Carver, and Kadamari Babsi, and even before them, the Gulf Labor Coalition. Be frank about the working conditions of you as a teacher in the architecture classroom, in academia, because our working conditions as teachers are the learning conditions of students, which is on some of my stickers as I'm one of those members of Eyck Academie, which is I constantly have to strike because of the labor conditions. Adopt an anti-colonial way of seeing. So looping back to Toni Morrison and Frantz Fanon, we have to think of the impossibility of kind of spatial innocence that really must integrate our curricula, and we have to embrace what Nicholas Mirzov calls an anti-colonial ways of seeing, which he sees as a refusal of what Fanon defined as an aesthetics of respect for the established order. So don't fall into the trap that they're to discuss the aesthetics of a building which has gentrified life. Because established order is to discuss aesthetics, because people refuse architecture because they don't like it or not. People usually refuse problematic projects because they know instinctively that they will transform their everyday life into something that is less their everyday life. Lala Medet also adopts an anti-fascist way of living. We can discuss what this can be, because we are really in trouble there. Complicate neutrality. Challenge the outdated understanding of architects as a professional and experts. While complicate the whole idea that discipline is separated with clear boundary, what is disciplinary and what is not. Objectivity, as not messing up with facts, often gets confused with neutrality. As Alenka Župančić frames it, quote, a neutral position is always and necessarily the position of the ruling classes. It seemed natural because it has achieved the status of the dominant ideology, which always strikes us as self-evident. The criterion of objectivity in such cases is thus not neutrality, but the capacity of theory to occupy a singular specific point of view within the situation. End of quote. And this is not just a theory, but this is the kind of architecture. So, refuse the idea that experts do not have a position on what they are doing. That doesn't mean acknowledging because when you don't have a position because you're an expert, you do have a position. It's a position of the status quo. It's the position of the system. And then it's okay, you can choose that position for your position. But don't confuse that with neutrality. Recognize life as a source of knowledge. Make room in the classroom for students to use their lived experience as a source of knowledge rather than devaluating it in favor of abstract and canonized knowledge. The classroom should be a safe space where trust is built and not assumed. Building on lived experiences challenges the overrepresentation of the specific experience that is considered universal. It insists on multiplicity and rejects competitivity. But what is also important to stress here, as so many architectural contexts, at least the ones in the UK now, are asking students to tap into their personal or family experience to grow project, that this is risky and challenging, And while this invitation is great, there are risks involved. This should not be prescriptive. For architecture, in architecture studio and teaching is many things, it maybe should not be a psychoanalysis as well. While architects like to know things that we can do everything, it's great it's great to acknowledge that there is a limit to what we can do. And also some of us just really didn't have a super interesting grandmas with really great quirky archives we can build a project on. And that is okay. Okay, which brings us to the Eduardo Glissant, which brings me to be reminded of what Eduardo Glissant, Monterican philosopher, said, the right to opacity. He developed this concept in relation to colonialists coming to colonize indigenous territories and insisting that they should share and give every knowledge, but violently taking it away, and insisting that Caribbean people have the right to opacity. This has been picked up a lot by these scholars of digital technology by reminding everyone that in the moment of super surveillance we are living in, we all actually have a right to opacity. We don't have to be transparency is a request for full-on transparency is violence. It's not when you apply it to corporations who are much better in exercising their right to opacity than we as individual people. Unfreeze history. Activate history is a non-linear critical tool to understand the present. Put at least some parts of Ariella issues as well potential history in relearning imperialism on your curriculum, especially if you're teaching a design studio. Design studio is this place in which we are kind of historically only think about the future. What does it mean if you ask as teachers or if you as a student decide what was here before? How that can change and inform different form of projects that came out. Maybe there are practices and traces of practices that you actually want to restore with your project. Because it's not only about the new. Because new is often in architecture, since modernism onwards, discontinuity. Mistrust technologies. Technology increasingly mediate how we love, live, how we die, how we interact with students, clients, and future users. I assume that so many of you who are sitting here, started studying during COVID and actually had education which was mediated through Zoom, Teams, or some other forms. Digital tools also completely transform the processes in architecture classroom and practice, changing the speed and accelerating the cycles of skilling, and reskilling. It is therefore crucial and important to resist the unbridled enthusiasm we are conditioned to have for technological innovation and fixes. And you can read Adam Greenfield's Radical Technologies. It's a really great way to kind of see technology in the design of everyday life. And remember, archive is also technology. So is space, so is the screen. And as in the architectural post-COVID, architectural education post-COVID, we really need to resist the screen. Hand drawing, sketches, collages, all those things resist the smoothness that comes with digital technology. Because the smooth image prevents one from engaging with. Because what is really important in architecture is also to engage critically with images. Architects pretend to ignore the immense power residing in images they are tasked to produce, to sell and conceal. Miroslav and I went to see the new Eyck Academie project in Prague yesterday, and I'm sure that project looks much smoother on all the different renderings that were made in order to present what it's going to do and how it's going to beautify that part of Prague. then the kind of really big problem of how do we actually like sheet materials clad smooth surfaces. I don't have to tell you, the detailing is done much better than any type of that building in the UK, but that speaks about the quality of construction work in England and UK, which leaves a lot to be desired. But these are important to think with because the images have become these main ways of producing imaginaries that projects carry. And they so often don't end up bringing the promised bright future, which is on those images. And if we think of this useful versus unuseful knowledge, the quality of the kind of the useful skill of architecture students producing beautiful images is one of the most prized upon skill. So how to be critical of the image? Be entangled with other species. The transformed spatial curriculum must challenge destructive relations enacted between humans and by specific groups of humans or non-humans, other species with whom we share this planet. Maria Puig de la Bella Casa urges us to accept that interdependence is not a contract, nor a moral idea, it's a condition. In cities, the interior space are much more biodiverse than exterior spaces. It's just that the largest chunk of that biodiversity we don't see. How can we learn to design for and then learn to design for and actually to learn to design with that condition? Natasha Myers considers Planthropos a human-plant relation as a society's basic political unit. What kind of teaching and design emerge when the human-non-human relation is understood as a basic spatial unit for which we design? Think intergenerationally. Decentering adulthood to work with those outside of it. Not only there are 2.2 billion children on Earth, but as Olufemio Taiwo says, quote, we should think about our ancestors, but we will win or lose our own ethical battles based on what we do for our descendants. We are defined by what kind of ancestors we choose to be. Don't forget about spaces of resistance while understanding how architecture oppresses. We spend a lot of time, fortunately, in architecture schools especially, employing our tools for building new spaces as a way to analyze how violence is enacted by spaces. But let's not forget while we document the violence of space or violent societies enact through space, that there is also resistance, because this is where our knowledge also lies, and there are also embers from which we can build the new world. Refuse violence and occupation. This is probably one of the most important frameworks, at least for me today. Understand spatial design as a support system. So what does it mean if you think through that what we are designing has to support something to happen in space and not has to appear in the world as something that is recognizable? Interrogate the idea of home and house. One of my favorite songs is by Gil Scott-Heron, and he says, which is called Home is Where the Hatred Is. House is a site of disciplining, which Andrew Santalucia reminds us. Architecture, it's probably possible to discuss the origin of architecture through the concept of shelter, but as Adrian Lacour provokes us, we should also rethink architecture, origin of architecture by thinking about it as a trap. What is a flat you own with a mortgage other than a trap? a future debt, your future time tied to your living space that you should own. Because as Robin Miner and Leon Batesamosaki Simpson tell us, there are 100 forms of home space. Or in the words of June Jordan, who trained as an architect, but became one of the most amazing poets to write Better World into existence, said, because I need to speak about home, I need to speak about living room, where the land is not bullied and beaten into a tombstone. I need to speak about living room, where the talk will take place in my language. I need to speak about living room, where my children will grow without horror. I need to speak about living room, where the men of my family between the ages of 6 and 65 are not marched into a roundup that leads to the grave. I need to speak about the living room where I can sit without grief, without wailing aloud for my loved ones, where I must not ask where Abu Fadi, because he will be there beside me. I need to talk about the living room because I need to talk about the home. What is a home in 2023? Imagine different worlds, the one that can hold many worlds together across this difference. One of the most important things I learned while I was an architecture student didn't come from architectural teachers. It came from Emil Jurtsen, who at the time was a fellow architecture student as well. We are the same age. But who at that time had this group called Pulska Group, a Pula group from city of Pula. And what he taught me was that, and called Pulska Group, was that people can't fight for the futures of spaces, they can't see them in their own imagination. So Pulska Group did the really important act of architectural project. They cut with the bolts, they cut the big chain, which was locking the gate of the abandoned military space, which is on a bay, which is 1/3 of Pula. So, and the fight is still ongoing, and this was in 2006, for which the city and country of Croatia and the county sees the future of this abandoned military half peninsula only as a golf resort, as a high-end tourist resort, something that is enclosed. Emil and his friends organized in Pulska Grupa realized people of Pula can't fight for that space until they actually can imagine and see it. So they can imagine it in their imagination, they can inhabit it in their imagination. But this has been a military space since Austro-Hungarian times. So no one really knew how the space looks. So that the first part of the fight for that space is to open up the gate and start organizing the walks so that people can start to imagine what they can do with that space. And this is where the power of architecture relies and resides, both in the school and outside of the school. We can trigger imaginaries that can help think about inhabiting the world differently. And this is why architecture is important, and this is why architecture design is important. So this work on frameworks is never finished. Architectural education flourishes in the ongoing reorientation, reorganization, and rearticulation. Rethinking architectural education from Royal College of Art is not like rethinking it from APFL that Charlotte teaches. It's really different from rethinking it from here. It's really different from thinking it here in Technical University from thinking it in architecture program in the Fine Arts School in Prague. So this is in the spirit of me really talking long. I would like to close by inviting you to spend some time now thinking together what can be added to this list. Which other frameworks we can design. So I will again ask you to look to your people, invite you to turn to the persons you speak with. Some of them have left. So find other people to turn, to introduce, to introduce yourself to. And maybe you can spend the next few minutes thinking, kind of coming up with frameworks that you would like to add. Thank you.